The Memphis Grizzlies went 10-4 in the month of December, and it was a pretty impressive mark that had a tough stretch during the holiday season. The embarrassing loss to the Warriors on Christmas Day stands out in everyone's minds. Yet Memphis beat the New Orleans Pelicans on New Year's Eve and had a better record by win percentage than the team whose head coach just won Coach of the Month. What's going on here and why am I not concerned about it? Let's lock in here on Locked On Grizzlies.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to this episode of Locked On Grizzlies, a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are free and available wherever you get podcasts. Thank you for checking us out on YouTube, liking, commenting, making sure you're subscribing there, as well as wherever you get your podcasts, Google, Stitcher, Spotify, Apple. We're everywhere. Thanks for making us a part of your Memphis Grizzlies experience, as always. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. You'll notice I'm once again flying solo here. Joe Mullinax with you. DeMichael Cole has been quite busy over at the Commercial Appeal. The beat writer for the Memphis Grizzlies being busy writing about the Memphis Grizzlies makes total sense. But one of the positives of bringing me on board as a member of the Locked On community, and especially as one of the hosts of this show, is I have the capacity to take on the burden, so to speak. It's not a burden talking to you. I shouldn't say it like that. But to take on the mantle of recording this show solo when DeMichael needs some time to focus on his Commercial Appeal duties. And I also can kind of make my own writing schedule. I am a freelance writer for SB and NBA for Fansided. I just had a post go up about the Lakers potentially making a trade for Fansided. And I also have my Substack Written in the Dark, which we'll talk more about here in a moment. So I could kind of do what I want in terms of this, being my main focus covering the Grizzlies. It's clearly not DeMichael's, understandably so. Again, when you're the beat writer for the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, makes total sense. So happy to do it. Hopefully DeMichael rejoins me soon. But I want to start our episode off today taking a look at the recent winner of the December Coach of the Month for the Western Conference. That was Willie Green of the New Orleans Pelicans. Now, I want to stress that I'm not going to hate on Willie Green. All right, I'm not going to, because the New Orleans Pelicans are one of the better teams in the Western Conference. You can't say that the Grizzlies are definitively better than the Pelicans, even though Memphis did recently defeat the Pelicans by double digits on New Year's Eve. That was the second night of a back-to-back for New Orleans. I think most Grizzlies and Pelicans fans would agree that it's the beginning of a long rivalry this decade of NBA basketball between the Memphis Grizzlies and the New Orleans Pelicans. Just one chapter in that rivalry, a chapter that Memphis won, but I digress. Willie Green went 10-5 in the month of December, which is a wonderful record. Taylor Jenkins, the head coach of the Memphis Grizzlies, went 10-4. And obviously, the loss on Christmas Day stands out in the minds of a lot of people because it was a pretty rough one, in fairness to everybody who maybe is criticizing that 1-3 road trip that the Grizzlies went on there close to the end of the month before they've righted the ship as of late with their win in Toronto, and then obviously beating the Pelicans and the Sacramento Kings the next night on New Year's Day. So I think that maybe part of it is the way that road trip went. The Pelicans didn't have a necessarily bad national loss in that way. But I think Taylor Jenkins probably, considering how Memphis performed in the month of December, should have won Coach of the Month, but I'm not sweating it. And here's why. Because over at my Substack newsletter, Written in the Dark, which I highly recommend you subscribe to, there's free and paid versions of subscriptions. It would be much appreciated. I've written about the Grizzlies specifically for a decade now, and it's a chance for me to focus on those Grizzlies. Like I mentioned a moment ago, I write about the Lakers. I do more national stuff. Now that I've left Grizzly Bear Blues as a writer, my Substack, Written in the Dark, is a chance to focus solely on the Grizzlies again. So free and paid options. I'm going to make a donation to a Memphis charity this month towards the end of the month. Subscribe there. And in my post for today, I wrote about how I'm not sweating the whole Willie Green getting December Coach of the Month because I think Taylor Jenkins is going to win Coach of the Year. Mind blown, right? Here's why. Here's why Taylor Jenkins is going to be the Coach of the Year. Because all of the teams that have coaches that, in my opinion, should be in the same conversation, whether it's Joe Mazzulla of the Boston Celtics, Jacques Vaughn of the Brooklyn Nets, obviously Green of the Pelicans should be in that conversation. You can also argue that, again, lots of different names that could be in that hunt. None of those teams have been in a position like the Grizzlies have been in terms of acquiring talent. JB Bickerstaff of the Cleveland Cavaliers was the other name that I just lost off the top of my head there. So Bickerstaff, Mazzulla, Vaughn, Green. I would say those four guys and Jenkins should be the top 5 for Coach of the Year. Not in that order necessarily. I think Jenkins is number 1. Look at Boston with Jason Tatum, Jalen Green, the depth and the talent, the Celtics recently being in the NBA Finals. They're supposed to be good, right? The Brooklyn Nets, Jacques Vaughn has done a great job resuscitating that season. The Nets are one of the best teams in the NBA, but they have the talent to be that, right? Kyrie Irving, Kevin Durant, Ben Simmons, an all-NBA player in the past, is their 3rd best player. They probably should be playing at this level. You look at the Western Conference. The Pelicans went out and traded for CJ McCollum. That is a player who is a key veteran contributor to what New Orleans is trying to do. Same thing in Cleveland with Donovan's 71-piece Mitchell being acquired by the Cavaliers. All of these teams either have talent in place or recently have acquired talent that puts them in the position of being a contender. If the Memphis Grizzlies are in that conversation, it is at the expense of what they have been as a talent contributing or a talent acquiring team for a contender in the traditional sense. And what do I mean by that? I've said it multiple times on this show and elsewhere. This front office of the Memphis Grizzlies, led by Zach Kleiman, who, don't forget, recently won Executive of the Year. They have not made a trade with the idea of traditional contendership in mind. They haven't. None of their moves have walked that way. Re-signing Steven Adams and Tyus Jones doesn't count. When Steven Adams is your most veteran player that has actually played, again, relax on the Danny Green talk. I'm glad he's there, but he's on ESPN as much as he is in Memphis, right? He's rehabbing from his knee. We'll see what his role is as the month of January becomes February, and he supposedly gets cleared around the All-Star break. You can't claim veteran presence on a 34-year or 35-year-old that hasn't actually played yet a minute for the Grizzlies. David Roddy, who was a part of that Philly trade with DeAnthony Melton, he's logged almost 600 minutes by comparison. So we need to relax a bit on talking about Danny Green as that veteran presence. There has not been a single acquisition that has made the Memphis Grizzlies a contender through the efforts of the front office. If you want to say that the development system that's been put in place by the Memphis Grizzlies is because of Zach Kleiman and company, I could listen to that argument. I think that's fair. And again, he was named Executive of the Year recently. Obviously, he is viewed as one of the best in the National Basketball Association at his job. But Taylor Jenkins should be too. Because when Desmond Bane, who much of the NBA world acknowledges is a very good offensive player, has missed a lot of time this year, John Conchar has played a lesser player than Bane, and they haven't missed much of a beat. When Jaren Jackson Jr. missed the start of the season because of his foot injury, and Santi Aldama was the starter in his place, they did not miss much of a beat, both in terms of record and in terms of the numbers. Aldama lineups and Conchar lineups are among the most efficient in the NBA when it comes to starting fives, when they're in there. It's because of the development system in place, it's because of the schemes in place, and it is because of the coach in place. So shout out to Willie Green of the New Orleans Pelicans. Congratulations on your December Coach of the Month award. It's deserved. I am of the belief that Taylor Jenkins is going to win Coach of the Year because he is doing more with less and with a front office that has not gone all in yet. Is it possible that happens over the next 2 months? I suppose so. But I have not seen them do anything that would suggest that they are interested in that thought process at this time. So Taylor Jenkins, kudos to you, sir, you are my choice for Coach of the Year so far in the NBA. And I have a feeling if things carry on the way that they have been, you'll be receiving that award come the spring. We'll talk about the lay of the land in the Western Conference in terms of All-Star voting. That has been a major focus lately on social media and elsewhere, especially for the Grizzlies. Next, here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. You can get the latest odds and trends from every professional and amateur league out there, pro football, basketball, everything in between. They've got it all over at betonline.net. They are the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info, and they also have great sports podcasts. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. Bet online, where the game starts. We are going to talk All-Star voting and who should make it from the Memphis Grizzlies next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Stay locked in. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host on this episode, Joe Mullinax, flying solo. Once again, I missed Michael Cole terribly. He ups the cuteness quotient of the show remarkably. The handsomeness, maybe, for grown men is the better way to put it. But hopefully he returns soon. Busy guy, understandable. We're getting by here on Locked On Grizzlies just fine. In my opinion, I'm biased with me running the show. And I want to talk All-Star voting because I'm a big fan of the numbers. You know, Sean Coleman, my predecessor here at Locked On Grizzlies, he's Stats SAC, right? He was even more into numbers than I am, but I think that the numbers help tell the story in addition to what your eyes tell you. So I like NBA Math on Twitter. They do a great job. They have a podcast, Hardwood Knocks podcast through NBA Math, I believe it's called. I really like their Twitter account, and they every once in a while talk about who the West All-Stars should be per their MVP predictor, right? They really like Nikola Jokic, who's having another remarkable season as their MVP. So unsurprisingly, Jokic is in the mix as a starter in the Western Conference. Now, you have to keep in mind that this doesn't take into account voting, right? Like Andrew Wiggins, who had a good season last year for the Golden State Warriors, you could argue was the best player for the Warriors in their NBA Finals series. That's not really a realistic best player in the Western Conference, right? That was about the fan vote last season. So this takes all of that out of account. This is about the numbers according to NBA Math. The starters, and this is from December 30th, were Luka Doncic, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Nikola Jokic, who we just mentioned, Anthony Davis, and Zion Williamson. The bench would be Steph Curry, Devin Booker, Domantas Sabonis, LeBron James, Lauri Markkanen, Ja Morant, Damian Lillard. Now, what stood out to me about this tweet is I think that's fairly realistic, both in terms of starters, because I do think Jokic will be a starter. Obviously, I think Curry would replace probably SGA. I think that LeBron would probably replace somebody in there, Anthony Davis perhaps. But I think AD did enough until he got hurt, which I'll mention more in a moment. Zion, for sure, has done enough. And you look at those guys, you know, Sabonis is having a massive offensive season for the Kings. Markkanen is one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, that the Jazz are still relevant as the calendar turns to 2023 in the playoff race. It's really impressive what he and the Jazz have done, and he's been their MVP. So for him to be in that spot, isn't that surprising? Ja being on the bench, maybe he's not a starter this year. Again, fan vote-wise, I think I'd be surprised if he wasn't a starter, but it's possible. I do believe he'll be an all-star in general. And, you know, he's one of the more popular players in the league now. So him being a starter instead of SGA, for example, wouldn't be too far of a jump. Damian Lillard of the Blazers having a resurgent year coming off of injury himself. The alternates per NBA Math were Ayton of the Suns, Fox of the Kings, who, if you've watched him play, different player this year in a good way, doing really well. Jeremy Grant of Portland, he's probably the first one that I look at and think, he's not actually in the conversation. Anthony Simons, also of the Portland Trailblazers. And then Anthony Edwards of the Timberwolves, who's having a good season as the Wolves try to get their stuff together, so to speak, there in Minnesota. So I look at this, and again, it's focused on numbers. It takes the fan vote out of it, but it also takes aside the health aspect of things, right? Like Steph Curry, probably not going to play in the All-Star game. You could say that Anthony Davis, probably not going to play in the All-Star game. Zion Williamson just came out that he's going to miss several weeks due to health issues with a hamstring pull. Maybe he's healthy for the All-Star game, but will he sit it out as a precaution since he's missing as much time as he's going to miss in January? So there are several names on this list, whether it's because of injury or whether it's just because they're not in a position to actually make the team, that will not be there. So besides Ja Morant, who is the best bet for the Memphis Grizzlies in terms of making the All-Star team? I think it's important to point out that it's unlikely that anybody outside of Ja Morant makes the All-Star team this year because of games missed, right? That's not a knock necessarily on Jaren Jackson Jr. or Desmond Bane, but Jaren's only played 20 games so far this season. Desmond Bane's only played 17. They're probably not going to make up the ground necessary to overcome the numbers that are being put up by other guys in larger sample sizes, right? So I would like to think that Jaren in particular, he's done so well defensively, a true defensive player of the year candidate. I think that he is worthy of recognition in that area. And maybe he does get picked as a reserve by the coaches in the Western Conference or something like that because of how dominant he is on that end. And again, he's played 20 games. He'll probably get up to around 30 or so by February. So that's close to half the schedule, so to speak. So maybe he gets the nod. But I do feel that injury is going to be something that limits those two guys, regardless of how well they've played. I think that there's two guys that have played a lot for the Grizzlies that should be considered for the All-Star game that aren't going to get the consideration. And they're Dillon Brooks and Steven Adams, right? Steven Adams is someone who is a very niche player in terms of his rebounding, the way that he sets screens, all the things that we talked about on yesterday's episode make Steven Adams very important to the Memphis Grizzlies. But he also is somebody that opposing teams dread to play. The physicality that he brings to the court, the way that he attacks the glass. He is a 7-foot large human that is going to use his body in a variety of ways to make your life miserable. And he knows how to do it in a basketball sense extremely well. So I like the idea of All-Star Steven Adams. Probably not going to happen. I also like the idea of All-Star Dillon Brooks because of how he has done as a passer. His assist percentage has really grown this past year. He's made it a focal point of his game, and it's one of the areas that he continues to strive to be better in. His turnover percentage is better than it's been in the past. He shows the capacity to develop and grow, and he's still an extremely impactful player. Again, his on-off stats are just remarkable. He's in the top 95th percentile in the NBA. He's a plus 12.8, the best of his career. Very few players in the NBA impact winning the way that Dillon Brooks impacts winning. But the key word there is impacting winning. The All-Star game is not necessarily about that, right? It's about who are your superstars in the National Basketball Association, guys that move the needle, so to speak. And that's one of, going back to my point from the previous segment about Taylor Jenkins, one of the reasons that Taylor Jenkins should be the coach of the year is Santi Aldama and John Conchar have played the same amount of games going into tonight's contest with the Hornets, 37 games, as Bane and Jackson Jr. have played. And the team has not missed a beat. The Pelicans have had some injury issues, not saying they haven't, but outside of the Pelicans, it's not really a contest in terms of the best teams in the NBA that have been doing it while injured or doing it while having concerns with health. That's a testament to what Taylor Jenkins has built. And the fact that Ja Morant is a pretty clear all-star, again, I think he'll get in on the fan vote as a starter, but even if he doesn't, he'll be a reserve. Because of injury, I'm not sure the Grizzlies have another all-star this year. You could argue, again, Jaren Jackson Jr. is probably the best argument in terms of on-court impact, how much the Grizzlies defense has improved with his presence. Desmond Bane has had a few slow games coming back from his toe injury. So even though he's played 17 games, the all-star effort that he was showing before his toe injury has not yet manifested itself. Jaren had the advantage of coming in once the season started. Desmond came in during the start of the season, got his injury, and is now trying to get back into the swing of things. That matters. The way that progression occurs is important. So I think Jaren is probably the Grizzlies' number 2 chance to slide in if an Anthony Davis, a Zion Williamson, a Steph Curry, if those guys can't go. But I do believe that it's important to point out that we didn't mention Devin Booker at all. We didn't mention Klay Thompson at all, who just scored 54 points. There are other guys that are going to be in that conversation that we really have to keep in mind. I just don't see a path for anyone not named Ja Morant to make the All-Star game for the Grizzlies in Utah. But I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that you're voting. I know I've voted for both Bane and Jackson Jr. I'll continue to do so, and I hope you do as well over at NBA.com. We will preview Grizzlies Hornets next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Do not go anywhere. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host, Joe Mullinax, flying solo to Michael Cole, finishing up some work for the Commercial Appeal. Hopefully he rejoins us in the near future. We want to talk about the Charlotte Hornets and the Grizzlies going at it tonight. It's going to be an interesting game, partially because of injury concern. Brandon Clark not playing for the Grizzlies, so that means larger opportunities for guys like Xavier Tillman. Santi Aldama is questionable for the game, so you might see some X getting some more extended run. You might see some smaller lineups with Dillon at the 4, depending on what Charlotte does, which will be really fascinating. It allows for some flexibility within what Taylor Jenkins wants to try to do against this Hornets team. Hayward is unlikely to play, Gordon Hayward, for the Hornets, nursing a hamstring injury. It's possible he plays. Cody Martin, a good three-point shooter for the Hornets, has been out for several weeks, but this might be the game that he returns for the Hornets. So it's going to be a lot of interesting pieces in play for this Charlotte team, but the Charlotte team starts and ends in terms of interest with LaMelo Ball, who is one of the more exciting players in the NBA. He's somebody that doesn't really get discussed as much, not necessarily because he's in Charlotte, but he's had some injury issues. There's been some stuff that has slowed his start to this year. But since he's gotten back into the starting lineup, 23.7 points per game, almost 8 assists. He's shooting a very impressive 37% from the three-point line on 11 attempts, right? 37% is, probably average in the modern NBA, but on 11 attempts, that's very high volume shooting. That means he's making 4 threes a game. That matters a lot. So Terry Rozier, he's scoring 20 points a game for the Charlotte Hornets, but he's not doing it efficiently. He's shooting 39% from the field, 31% from 3. LaMelo Ball is doing it efficiently. He's dishing it out to opponents, or to his teammates, excuse me. He's also giving it to opponents at times, 3.4 turnovers per game. But with the usage of Ball and how important he is to that offense, that's going to be pretty meaningful. PJ Washington's doing a lot. I believe it's a contract year for PJ, and he's showing some worth there, 34% from 3 on his part. Really a good player in terms of overall effort defensively. He's kind of like Brandon Clark in that way, a malleable piece that can defend multiple positions, can switch on the perimeter. Mason Plumlee, one of the Plumlee brothers, right? Getting some decent run there to almost 28 minutes a game, getting over 9 rebounds a game there for the Hornets. That'll be a fun matchup between he and Steven Adams, another more traditional big in the case of Plumlee, taking on Steve-O. And then you've got players like Dennis Smith Jr., which I think is just a really cool story. Former first-round pick who's kind of flamed out, hasn't had the success that a lot of folks thought he would or should have. And he's having a bit of a resurgence there in Charlotte for the Hornets. Again, about 9 points a game, but he's doing it somewhat efficiently, and he is taking advantage of the opportunities he's getting in a pretty large sample size. He's probably their 6th man this season. And because of the injuries to Kelly Oubre Jr., who's been an important part, another 20-point scorer for the Hornets that won't be playing in this game because of a recent, I believe, thumb injury. It's going to be really interesting to see how the Hornets adjust. And it's going to make game planning for these Hornets difficult because of how significant both Hayward and Oubre Jr. have been to Charlotte. That's a large chunk of their offense that's out. So you would imagine Terry Rozier, and that's probably the guy that you want to take more shots because of his lack of efficiency. You would imagine he'll be more active. You'd imagine LaMelo Ball will take on a larger chunk of the offense. But where that ball gets spread to, James Bouknight, who a lot of people were excited about in the draft a couple of years ago here in Memphis. Jalen McDaniels is another young player that has a lot of talent. Opportunity is opening up, and it also leads for chances to not fully have a concept as to what the opponent is going to do to you. So while you look at this game and you say, the Grizzlies should run away with this, right? They're not taking on a team that is at full strength, and they're also one of the worst teams in the NBA at 10-28. Keep in mind those road woes that we've talked about recently. Defense travels until it doesn't. And if the Grizzlies don't play with defensive energy, and if they overlook this Charlotte team looking ahead to other games down the road against tougher opponents, Charlotte will embarrass them. They have that capacity. LaMelo Ball has only played in about half, a little less than half, of Charlotte's games this season, and LaMelo Ball is going to be one of the best players on the floor in this contest for either team. So if you don't hone in on him, and you would hope that Dillon Brooks will take that defensive assignment, but if you don't prioritize slowing down LaMelo Ball and making the Terry Rozier's and Mason Plumlees of the world beat you, he has a capacity within his game to rise or raise up the quality of play of those around him. And they can make this a game when perhaps they shouldn't. Again, the Grizzlies are favored. You could argue they should be favored. It's not necessarily a game that Memphis should even necessarily be pushed all that much in, if you really want to be honest about it, because of how strong the Grizzlies have started their season and the current state of the Hornets because of their injury concerns. Steven Adams should dominate Plumlee. Adams is having, like I said, in my opinion, arguably an all-star season. So if he's not quite an all-star, but he is a role-playing all-star, doing what he's supposed to do in terms of his job as well as he possibly can, you continue to look to Adams to be that guy against a lesser player in Plumlee. If Dillon Brooks is able to neutralize LaMelo Ball to an extent with his physicality, his length, his ability to use his size to his advantage, what does that mean in terms of slowing down the other guys? If Ja Morant or Desmond Bane draws the Rozier assignment, Terry Rozier has the capacity to score the basketball, and he can get hot. He has a very strong microwave capacity in terms of scoring output. So if you don't put yourself in a position to be prepared to limit what the Hornets are going to try to do through ball, they can make this game close. And if that happens, the Grizzlies are going to be in a spot where they don't want to be in a competitive game going into the fourth quarter. It shouldn't be a competitive game. Kelly Oubre Jr. is a large loss for Charlotte. They are not especially deep on the wing. The reserves, like John Conchar, Zaire Williams, if he plays, he's questionable for this one with knee soreness. If Zaire plays, he's going against reserve wings that he should be able to dominate. And even if Zaire does not play, other reserve wings that maybe get more opportunity, Conchar being the lead example, continued chances for open shots, continued chances to have great energy play, both on offense and defense. And it starts on that defensive end. So for me, a major key to the game is starting fast defensively. Don't let LaMelo Ball get into a rhythm. Blitz him. Be physical with him. Put him in positions where he is not comfortable. Don't let him get into a rhythm. Because if he does, that's where Charlotte has a chance. If you take away Ball and you make Terry Rozier beat you, if Rozier is able to beat you, you tip your cap and say, excellent job, Charlotte. You're the better team on this night. I am confident most simulations of this game, that doesn't occur. LaMelo Ball can beat you. And I think that the Grizzlies know that, and they will do their best to limit him. It'll be a fun game, a good chance for Memphis to continue to find their footing in terms of road wins. But in the wild and crazy Western Conference, where Memphis is fairly close to being the number one team again, but is also a losing streak away from being in the play-in conversation, they need to pick up wins like this to hold serve and stay in this spot as they approach tougher games on their schedule. So this is a business trip game for the Memphis Grizzlies. They need to go out, handle their business, do what they're supposed to do against a lesser team like the Charlotte Hornets, get on the plane and get out of there. Pick up the win. Don't disrespect your opponent. Everybody on the Charlotte Hornets is an NBA player, and LaMelo Ball is one of the better young ones in the entire NBA. He has the capacity to make this a game if the Grizzlies allow him to. But with Dillon Brooks there, I have a confidence in saying that's unlikely to occur as long as they maintain that defensive energy, which again has been an issue, especially in road games. This would be a good chance for a get-right contest for the Grizzlies. Thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen today. Now make your second listen Game to Game NBA. Every moment, every top performance, every result, Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. The next time you and I are together, we will talk Grizzlies Hornets. We will look ahead to the games down the road for the Memphis Grizzlies. And we mentioned how close the Western Conference is. Maybe revisit that, talking about who is a real threat to Memphis, because I think most folks accept that the Grizzlies are going to be in this conversation. They're not necessarily going anywhere as they get their feet under them and they stay healthy. If Ja Morant were to get hurt, or if Jaren Jackson Jr. were to get hurt again, Desmond Bane, maybe we're having a different conversation. But assuming health, knock on wood, the Grizzlies will be sticking around. Who are the real teams as the calendar turns to keep an eye on? And we probably can look at the schedule a little bit to help us there as well. Those are all fun things that we'll continue to talk about here on Locked On Grizzlies as the season grinds along. Thank you so much for liking and commenting on YouTube. Continue to share and subscribe and all those sorts of things. Make us a part of your Grizzlies process there. Thank you for rating, reviewing, subscribing, wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for making us your first listen each and every day. We are proud parts of the Locked On Podcast Network, DeMichael and I, and I'm grateful to continue to be doing this. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I look forward to next time. Until then, continue to lock in, Grizzlies fans. This is Locked On Grizzlies.